Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 389. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to get through on today's show, so just want to remind people to share the show, subscribe to the show, do what you can to support. It's hosted with the Libertarian Institute, so you can make a donation with the Institute. You can just share the show from there. I also write for the Institute, so find my articles on that website, libertarianinstitute.org. I'm the news editor at antiwar.com, and I post a show on the blog at that site, and I also write for antiwar.com, at least one or two articles a week, and then I work on putting the viewpoint section together at that website. I'm on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. The show is on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. If you want to subscribe to the video version, it's up anywhere and everywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. So just, if you can, like, share, subscribe, make a donation to the Institute or antiwar.com, and we will get into everything I have today, which is quite a bit. All right. Chinese leader to visit Moscow as China and Russia draw closer together. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Wednesday that Chinese President Xi will be visiting Moscow as soon as China and Russia continue to draw closer together in the face of similar Western pressure. Putin made the announcement while hosting China's top diplomat Wang Yi in Moscow. We await a visit from the president of the People's Republic of Russia. We have agreed on this, Putin said. Everything is progressing, developing. We are reaching new frontiers. Wang said China and Russia have reached new levels of cooperation. He expects trade between the two nations to reach $200 billion per year in 2024, up from $185 billion in 2022. He expressed favor for a multipolar world and said China and Russia have withstood pressure from other countries. Together, we support multipolarity and democratization in international relations. Wayne said, this fully meets the course and time and history. It also has interests of the majority of countries. Wang is the highest level Chinese official to visit Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. The trip comes amid accusations that Beijing is considering providing Moscow with military assistance, a claim which the foreign minister rejected. While China and Russia have increased ties over the past year, they are both facing sanctions and military buildups from the U.S. There are no signs yet that Beijing has provided weapons to Moscow's war effort or that it is interested in doing so. So this also came as China was preparing a 12-point peace plan, and I believe Wang met with both. He did meet with the Ukrainian foreign minister last week and then President Putin. So China then released its 12-point plan over the weekend. I think it was expected on Friday, but I don't think it came out until Saturday or Sunday. It did come out on Friday. Dave writes here. So this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. China on Friday released a 12-point peace plan as a potential settlement for the war in Ukraine. U.S. officials are claiming Beijing is considering arming Russia. The plan released on the Chinese Foreign Ministry website calls for a cessation of hostilities and a resumption of peace talks between warring sides. The plan says dialogue and negotiations are a viable solution to the Ukrainian crisis. All efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis must be encouraged and supported, the plan says. And then these are the 12 points. Respecting the sovereignty of all countries, abandoning the Cold War mentality, ceasing hostilities, resuming peace talks, resolving the humanitarian crisis, protecting civilians and POWs, keeping nuclear power plants safe, reducing strategic risk, facilitating grain exports, stopping unilateral sanctions, keeping industrial and supply chains stable, promoting post-conflict reconstruction. While some Ukrainian officials criticized the plans, President Zelensky expressed openness to some of the ideas and said he would meet with Chinese President Xi. I believe the fact that China has started talking about Ukraine is not bad, he said. So this is interesting since the West has mostly rejected this peace plan. Although I think Ukraine has some economic ties with China, so maybe this is why Zelensky just isn't rejecting it because, this is I think probably a big deal for Xi to lay out this peace plan, and if China were able to negotiate kind of absent of the U.S. to come to some kind of resolution here, although I think the U.S. would probably have to be involved in any kind of resolution, but if China was the main negotiator and really the U.S. just had to kind of sign on to it or something, then it would be a big deal for Beijing in moving towards a multipolar world. And so this is, interesting that the West is rejecting it, that Zelensky says he's open to it. Now, Biden says it's the idea China is going to be negotiating the outcome of the war is totally unjust for Ukraine is not rational. So, this is ridiculous, but this is what the U.S. has said time and time again, that, China hasn't condemned the war in Ukraine, and that's why they can't mediate it. Of course, the U.S. feels that, the mediator should probably be a Western country, right, that is firmly within supporting Ukraine. And of course, that's going to make sure that talks really don't progress anywhere. Following the release of China's plan, U.S. officials repeated their claims that China is considering sending weapons to Moscow to aid the Russian war effort, an allegation the Chinese Foreign Ministry has rejected. CIA Director William Burns said Sunday that he was confident Chinese leadership was considering sending arms, but there was no evidence they've made the decision to do so. He said the purpose of publicizing the claim was to deter China from arming Moscow, as the U.S. has threatened consequences if Beijing takes the steps. In the early days of the war, U.S. officials claimed Russia asked China for military assistance, but was later revealed by a report from NBC News that the U.S. didn't have hard evidence to back up that claim. And I think that was pretty much admitted that was a part of an information warfare scheme against China. So, if the U.S. is doing that, waging information war here against China, as China is actually trying to bring an end to this war, that is extremely concerning and really problematic for the White House. It, goes to show that even a year into this, right, we already know that in March and April, that the West, sabotaged and undermined talks that could have ended the war in Ukraine, but that they're doing this, a whole year into the war still, as we've seen hundreds of thousands of deaths, definitely on the Ukrainian side, likely on the Russian side too. It really does, go to show that Ukrainian lives do not matter to Washington, and that they really just want to see a pile of dead Russian bodies at no matter what the cost. So, I guess we will figure out in the coming days as to, why the U.S. is making these claims now. And again, if it's information warfare, as, China is proposing a peace plan that Ukraine is at least saying, well, it's not that bad, is very concerning. Now, we're getting a different statement from the French and the Germans. Report Macron Schultz told Zelensky to start thinking about peace talks. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and French President Emmanuel Macron told Ukrainian President Zelensky that he should start thinking about peace talks with Moscow, the Wall Street Journal reported. The message was delivered to Zelensky when he had dinner with Macron and Scholz in Paris earlier this month. According to people familiar with the meeting, they told Zelensky that even mortal enemies like France and Germany had to make peace after World War II. Unlike most Western leaders, Scholz and Macron maintained contact with Russian President Vladimir Putin throughout the war. Macron has repeatedly discussed the idea of a peace deal with Russia that would have to take into account Moscow's concerns, although he's still calling for a Ukrainian offensive to retake more territory. What we need now is for Ukraine to launch a military offensive which pushes back the Russian front in order to open the way to return to negotiations, Macron said at the Munich Security Conference. And so my guess is that it's where the emphasis is, because both sides, this is what Washington is saying too, that we need an offensive and then we need peace talks. But my guess is Macron is saying, you really got to start thinking about these peace talks, where the White House is saying, we'll support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but at some point there's going to be peace talks. I think the probably significance is quite different in how these leaders are portraying it. A journal reported that while France and Germany favor the idea of peace talks, they also support a British proposed plan that would significantly deepen military cooperation with the post-war Ukraine. British Prime Minister presented the blueprint for the agreement this week that would give Ukraine access to more advanced NATO equipment. The idea of the agreement would be to build up Ukraine's military after the war as a deterrent to future Russian invasion, instead of providing Kiev with a war guarantee like Moscow's Article 5. The U.S. has been more hawkish than France and Germany, but the journal said that the British Prime Minister bats the idea of the idea of bringing the deal used to incentivize Ukraine to the negotiating table. He wants the plan on the agenda at NATO meeting in July and hopes Ukraine can recapture territory before then. Man, the territory is going in the opposite direction. So, all of this is concerning that the Western leaders don't seem to have a really good grasp of what's happening on the ground. So let's see, where are we going next? China says sending weapons to Ukraine won't bring peace. And this was comments made, I believe, on Thursday at the UN. Beijing just said, 1 year into the Ukraine crisis, brutal facts have offered ample proof that sending weapons will not bring peace. Adding fuel to the fire will only exacerbate tensions and prolong, and expanding the conflict will only make ordinary people pay an even heftier price. And so this is, a response to the U.S. allegations that China is preparing to send weapons to Ukraine. Now, it's interesting that the U.S. tries to stand on a moral high ground here when it is providing weapons to this war, and it, is a true belligerent to this war, where China clearly isn't, but the U.S., makes it out to be that China is really the one that's not acting with the international, because, within the way it should, when in reality, China is trying to negotiate an end to this war, why the U.S. is continuing it. So this is some analysis or some more news on the Russian decision to suspend the New START treaty. Last week when we were on the show, I said this was a really big deal. It's really concerning, but if Russia is just suspending this, they're not withdrawing from this, and Russia doesn't say that we're going to start building our nuclear arsenal in a way that violates the New START treaty, then this is something that we can move forward from potentially, where if Russia was going to start significantly altering their nuclear program, then that's going to make it a lot more difficult to negotiate. So this is what we have from late last week. Biden says Putin's decision to suspend New START, a big mistake. President Biden on Wednesday said Russian President Putin has made a big mistake by suspending Russia's participation in the last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, known as New START. When he made the announcement on Tuesday, Putin stressed that he was only suspending Russia's participation in New START, which places limits on the deployment of nuclear warheads and launchers. A Russian diplomat on Wednesday said Putin's move could be reversed if the U.S. takes steps to de-escalate tensions with Moscow. Suspension does not mean pullout. The situation can be reversed if the U.S. shows political will and makes honest efforts to make a significant general de-escalation, create conditions for the comprehensive operation of New START, the Russian envoy in Vienna said. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ravkov made similar comments. There are chances that the New START will be reinstated as it was, but that completely and utterly depends on U.S. behavior, its comprehension, or the failure to comprehend that policy it conducts towards Russia is malignant, he said. Biden has shown no interest in de-escalating tensions with Russia as he visited Ukraine on Monday and vowed support for the war as long as it takes. While there are many signs that some people in his administration are thinking about eventually winding down the military aid, they are still pushing Ukraine to launch a counteroffensive and making it clear they support attacks on Crimea, risking major escalation in the coming months. The U.S. and Russia were engaged in arms control talks at the beginning of last year, but President Biden canceled the negotiations after Russia invaded Ukraine. The U.S. and Russia eventually agreed to hold a meeting under the New START treaty in November 2022, but Moscow canceled the talks at the last minute, citing U.S. tensions over Ukraine. While Biden is critical of Putin's decision, his administration previously rejected a Russian offer to salvage an arms control treaty that the Trump administration withdrew from, known as Open Skies, which allowed unarmed surveillance flights over participating countries. When Biden was running for office in 2020, he sharply criticized the Trump administration's decision to pull out of Open Skies. He said the move would exacerbate ongoing tensions between the West and Russia and increase the risk of miscalculation and conflict. But after he became president and Russia offered to salvage the Open Skies treaty, Biden said no. So, I think the Russian statements here are really important. Now, we have this from Victoria Nuland, who is, of course, very hawkish. And, you have to, anytime the U.S. is putting her out front of anything diplomatically with Russia, that's likely going to be a problem for the Kremlin because she has been so anti-Russia. Putting a face like William Burns, even though he's the director of the CIA on this, would probably be a little bit easier to handle. Because, as I'm sure most of my listeners know, she's largely behind the 2014 coup in Ukraine and potentially even the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines. So Nuland says U.S. ready to discuss New START with Russia tomorrow. Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, told the Russian news agency TASS on Thursday that the U.S. was ready to hold discussions with Moscow in the New START treaty on the New START treaty tomorrow if Russia is willing to do the same. Her comments came after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced he was suspending Russia's participation in New START, which limits the deployment of warheads and launchers and is the last remaining arms control treaty between the two powers. We're ready to do it tomorrow if the Russian Federation is ready, and we're also ready to allow inspections. According to the State Department, inspections under New START have been paused since March 2020 due to COVID-19. The U.S. requested to conduct an inspection over the summer, but Russia said no, citing U.S. sanctions they said impeded Russia's ability to inspect Washington's nuclear weapons. The U.S. and Russia eventually agreed to hold a meeting under the New START treaty in November. That was supposed to be hosted in Egypt, but Moscow canceled. So I think that the fact that the U.S. is putting Victoria Nuland out to make this offer, who knows? Maybe TASS actually contacted Victoria Nuland, but say they contacted the State Department and Victoria Nuland, who responded, would probably be problematic. But anyways, the U.S. here doesn't seem to really understand what Russia is saying. This is kind of what the U.S. was tried to do. With I think, I'm sorry, lost my train of thought there. Anyways, what I'm saying is, I think what the U.S. is trying to do is piecemeal its relationship with Russia too much, and Moscow isn't going to go for that. If there's all these hostilities over Ukraine, that Russia isn't going to negotiate with arms control. If the U.S. is, providing the weapons to Ukrainian forces that kill tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, that's probably going to lead to Russia being less interested in negotiating with the U.S., particularly when the situation around the New START treaty wasn't going well, even prior to the invasion, hostility. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia was already in a downward spiral. So We have a couple more statements here on nukes. Putin says Russia cannot ignore NATO's nuclear capabilities. Russian President Vladimir Putin said Sunday that Moscow can't ignore all of NATO's nuclear capabilities since NATO leaders have been calling for Russia's defeat. I think this is a somewhat fair statement for Russia to make. One of the things I think they say about New START is that the UK and France recently said that they were going to, definitely the UK was going to ramp up their nuclear weapons program. And so Russia's saying, well, look, NATO is a collective treaty with, its spear pointed again, the tip of its spear pointed against Russia. And so while the US may not be increasing its nuclear arsenal, if the UK is, that's problematic for Moscow. And I think understandably so. Now, this is concerning. It seems that Russia, the Kremlin, is issuing some nuclear threats again. Medvedev says Russia is willing to defend itself with nuclear weapons. Former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev warned Wednesday that Russia is willing to defend itself by any means necessary, including nuclear weapons. It's obvious to all the powers that be that the U.S. wants to defeat Russia. We are heading for a conflict on a global scale. If the U.S. wants to defeat Russia, we have a right to defend ourselves with any weapon, including of the nuclear kind, Medvedev wrote on Telegram, according to the Russian news agency TASS. So I will say he is in the government, right? So his perspective isn't meaningless, but understand that Medvedev is typically the most hawkish official in Washington. And, I think in the past we would understand from the American perspective that when John Bolton's in the administration, he makes a statement that he's making the most extreme statement, on U.S. foreign policy, that the most extreme perspective. I think that's that's the role that Medvedev serves in Putin's administration at this point. All right, next up, I have an article that I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday. White House believed economic nuclear weapon would end Russian war in Ukraine. In the days after the invasion of Ukraine, the White House assessed President Vladimir Putin would end the attack if the U.S. froze over $300 billion owned by Russia's central bank. However, the Washington-led economic war on Moscow has failed to have a major impact on the Russian economy. According to Bloomberg, in the immediate reaction to Russian forces invading Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the White House began to develop the economic equivalent of a nuclear weapon, that's their term, to use against Moscow. National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan led the team that designed the sanctions on Moscow's economy and froze $300 billion assets of the Russian central bank. The Joe Biden administration believed the economic war inflicted shock and awe on the Russian economy. Bloomberg reported some American officials worry the actions would do too much damage to Russia. So far, the Western economic war on Russia has failed to have its designed impact on Moscow's economy, despite predictions of double-digit GDP contraction in 2022. The Russian economy has held firm, with the ruble one of the top-performing currencies against the dollar. Nicholas Mulder, a Cornell professional specializing in sanctions, says Washington has changed its strategy. They've given up the expectations that this will change Russian decision-making. He continued, instead, they see it as an economic war of attrition. And think of what that means, because, as I point out here, citizens in Western nations have felt the impact of the economic war. Energy prices have skyrocketed in Europe. Meanwhile, Americans have struggled with decades-high inflation. And so they, are willing to sacrifice you in this economic war of attrition because they think it might hurt Russia a little bit. In recent years, sanctions have become a favorite tool for policymakers in Washington, as foreign policy analyst Richard Hayana explains in Cato. Sanctions are mostly used because they give the impression that the American government is doing something between war and nothing. The U.S. has maintained extensive sanctions over North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and Syria for decades. The embargoes have failed to change the governments of those countries, but international organizations point out the sanctions have caused civilians in those countries to suffer. Elena Duan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Coercive Measures, said social or humanitarian aid can't be supplied because of sanctions despite existing exemptions. She argued that a country targeted by unilateral sanctions can slide backwards on the development scale. She warned that sanctions may be a major threat preventing targeted countries from achieving universal sustainable development goals that are meant to improve the lives of everyone. Experts on U.S. Expert on U.S. economic warfare Daniel Larson claims Washington has credibility issues with our sanctions. Our government has real credibility problems in that our promises to lift sanctions and make our concessions are not believable. He continued, this greatly complements the ability of our negotiators, to bargain with governments to resolve outstanding disputes. Still, the Biden administration is preparing to roll out another tranche of sanctions on Moscow in the coming days. The new sanctions will target Russian banks, the financial sector, and the defense industry. The European Union is also planning a new round of sanctions and is considering using the $300 billion in frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine's reconstruction. As the U.S. has sanctioned an increasing number of countries, Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Syria, Yemen, North Korea, Zimbabwe, China, and Russia, institutes such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization have grown to facilitate trade between blacklisted countries. The relationship between countries that are sanctioned by the U.S., such as Iran, Russia, and other countries, can overcome many problems and issues and make them stronger, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi said. And he made this statement at the time that Iran was joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Putin was there, and so was Xi and a lot of these other world leaders, like even Erdogan. The Americans think whichever country they impose sanctions on, it will be stopped. Their perception is a wrong one, Raisi added. So, I think looking back on the war from 1 year and realizing how much of a failure that was, it is incredible. They thought this was an economic nuclear weapon, and it turned out to do not that much damage to the Russian economy overall. And, I'm sure there is a lot of wealth being lost in Russia because of Putin deciding to invade a country. They're losing tens of thousands, probably the productive years of hundreds of thousands of their young men. A lot of their industrial base, of course, is going to be, repurposed and re-geared towards war. And, it's going to hurt the living standards of Russians, just as the war on terror and everything has hurt the living standards of Americans and then the long term. But at the same time, when we look at, just the short term in year one, it's clear that the U.S. sanctions really haven't had much of an impact, and that, we're all suffering needlessly, with higher prices, in the West, of course, in other areas of the world is far worse, where it's the fertilizer, wheat, and things like that Russia produces that, countries can't import because of American sanctions. So U.S. announces $2 billion arms package for Ukraine, new sanctions on Russia. So we got the new sanctions released over the weekend. And then we also got the Pentagon announcing a $2 billion military aid package, which includes HIMARS ammunition and 3 types of small drones that the U.S. has not previously sent. The weapons are being provided through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the Pentagon to purchase weapons for Ukraine. As we always point out, there's the 2 different ways the U.S. is sending weapons. Way one is through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which means Biden is authorizing American weapons to be given directly to Kiev. And then the other one is this security initiative, which is a fund that the Pentagon has to buy weapons for Ukraine. Now, this means at times, they're going to the company, they're going to buy 600 Switchblade drones, right? So they'll go to the company, they'll say, we want 600 Switchblade drones, and then, it takes 6 months, a year, whatever to manufacture, and then another 3, 4, whatever months to actually get them to Ukraine. So likely, if it's coming from this type of money, my assumption is going to take longer to get to Ukraine. But a lot of it depends on the type of weapon, how available they are. Just quickly going through the list of what's here: additional 155 millimeter artillery rounds, munitions for laser guided rocket systems, Cyber Lutz K8 drones, Switchblade drones, 600 of those. Altilis drones, 600 of those, 20 drum drones, counter UAS and electronic warfare detection equipment, mine clearing equipment, security communication support equipment, funding for training, maintenance, and sustainment. The U.S. has provided Ukraine with the Switchblade drones, but this is the first time the U.S. has pledged to send the Cyber Lutz K8, Artillerist 600, and Jump 20. Oh, I guess those are versions. My mistake. I thought they were saying they're going to send 600 of the artillerist drones, but Dave must have been writing that is the name of the drone, so I'm not sure how many are going. All right. Biden says no F-16s for now. So this is interesting because on the show I had predicting that they are going to send, are planning to send the F-16s to Ukraine. And I do think that's still the case. There is no basis upon which there is a rationale, according to our military now, to provide F-16s. I am ruling it out for now. However, I think what the White House is doing is kind of sandbagging on this one. I think they have a plan to go ahead and send the F-16s. I think the Ukrainians need to be trained for several months, and so that's the program that the UK is rolling out and working on right now. The Ukrainians gain training on these systems, and then in, I don't know, 6 or 9 months, once there's some training that's been provided, I think the debate is going to come very quickly, and they're going to go ahead and authorize transferring these drones to Ukraine. I do think that maybe this signals that the White House is at least minimally concerned about how Russia is going to escalate. And so by, let's say that, like, with the tanks and everything, the Abrams tanks aren't getting to Ukraine until next year. The Leopard's tanks, may not be there for several months. The Challenger tanks won't be there for several months. And so maybe it's better for these countries to kind of covertly put together the weapons packages, get all these tanks and everything ready to go, and then, announce it and send them very quickly, so Russia has less time to escalate and prepare. I mean, strategically, that seems to make a lot more sense to me. So I think that's what's happening here. But we'll see in the coming months if this debate comes back up and if the U.S. decides to give them F-16s. But I do think that's kind of the plan all along. Next up, I do have one. I don't have the article here, but Ukraine is talking about launching an attack on Crimea. This would be very concerning, of course. UN Security Council holds meeting on the Nord Stream sabotage. Ray McGovern spoke here and did a pretty good job. It's worth it to go and watch it, but I've done a lot of coverage, and I don't think we really have anything new here. China supports the investigation, but that is to be expected. This from last week, I think, is pretty important. In Poland, Biden vows to defend literally every inch of NATO. President Biden met with the leaders of the Bucharest 9 countries in Warsaw, Poland on Wednesday and vowed to defend literally every inch of NATO territory, calling Article 5 of the Alliance's treaty that outlines mutual defense to be sacred. The commitment to the United States, and I've said to you many times, is absolutely clear. Biden told the leaders of Hungary, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria. Article 5 is a sacred commitment the U.S. has made, and we will defend literally every inch of NATO, every inch of NATO. One of the things that is really upsetting is how religious we now look at NATO. NATO recently put out a tweet saying that the war in Ukraine was like Harry Potter fighting against Thanos, or some Thanos and the Harkonnens, or something absurd like this. But this kind of thinking, good versus evil, is really deep within a lot of these world leaders now, and the U.S. propaganda, the Western propaganda, is very concerning. Hungary to send delegation to Sweden and Finland over NATO bids. Hungary is one of the two countries that hasn't approved NATO membership for Sweden and Finland. My assumption is Hungary is willing to do it. That what they're basically trying to figure out is if Turkey is going to approve NATO membership, because if Turkey isn't going to do it, then Hungary doesn't have to do it, and that will probably help Hungary maintain a better relationship with Moscow. However, if Turkey does it, then Hungary will do it, because Hungary, I don't think, is willing to be the one NATO country that is preventing two new members from entering the alliance. And so, we'll see. Maybe Hungary is going to look for some kind of concessions or something here. The other thing I guess maybe Hungary is going for is to figure out if there is a way, because I think Turkey has now floated the idea of Finland joining the alliance without Sweden, if that's something that Hungary can support as well. Last up, Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, says U.S. will send $10 billion in economic aid to Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp on February 23rd. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the U.S. will send about $10 billion in additional economic assistance to Ukraine in the coming months. Since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, the U.S. has given Kiev at least $13 billion in budgetary aid, economic assistance that goes directly to the Ukrainian government to fund government services, pensions, and healthcare. Our economic assistance to Ukraine's resistance possible by supporting the home front, funding critical public services, and helping keep the government running, Yellen said in India ahead of the G20 finance ministers meeting. In the coming months, we expect to provide about $10 billion in additional economic assistance for Ukraine. Additional aid will be pulled from the $45 billion that Congress authorized to send to Ukraine in December. So far, the U.S. has provided about $113 billion in spending on the war, which includes military aid, training, funds for the Pentagon to replenish stockpiles and pay for troop deployments, and economic assistance. According to the summary of $45 billion aid package approved in December, $13 billion is allocated to economic and budgetary assistance. The U.S. has handed out tens of billions of dollars directly to the Ukrainian government despite notorious corruption. Last month, a corruption scandal rocketed Ukraine that resulted in the firing of several senior officials. And I don't know if you remember back in 2015, the pallets of cash, right? Everybody was concerned about the U.S. getting back the Iranians their money. Now we're sending Ukraine all this money, and there's no oversight or concern about it whatsoever. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more later in the week.